Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, and welcome to another weekend book review. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. You know how it is you're trying to stay informed, but it feels like you're just wading through endless streams of conflicting information? It can be tough, really tough to make sense of it all.
It truly can, and when you're faced with so many different narratives, so much noise, it's a natural human tendency, really, to look for underlying explanations, for patterns that might bring some clarity to things that feel confusing or frankly unsettling.
And that's exactly where we're heading in this deep dive, right into the world of conspiracy theories. We've been digging into some fascinating research, specifically a paper called Conspiracy Theories and Their Believers by Daniel Stockemer and Jean-Nicolas Bordeleau. And what's really interesting about this study, I think, is that it takes such a broad look. It examines both those conspiracy theories that seem to, pop up everywhere, and also those that are really specific to certain regions.
Yeah, and crucially, it does this across 8 different countries. So it gives us a chance to see who tends to gravitate towards these beliefs in very different settings.
Right, comparing different contexts. They looked at places like Australia, Canada, Germany, the U.S.
Exactly, sort of established Western democracies, but then also diverse non-Western settings,
Right.
like Brazil, Lebanon, Morocco, and South Africa.
Yeah.
It's quite a range.
It really is. So our aim today is basically to pull out the most important insights from this research for you, the listener. We want to get a handle on this complicated topic, conspiracy theories, without getting bogged down in, academic jargon.
And hopefully uncover some things that might be a bit surprising along the way.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this. When we talk about a conspiracy theory, what are we actually talking about? According to this research, what are the key ingredients?
Well, the authors point out that at its heart, a conspiracy theory offers an explanation for a particular event. Simple enough, right? But these explanations, they typically share a common thread.
Which is?
The involvement of a powerful group, often operating in secret. That element of hidden action, of secrecy, is really central.
Right, so it's more than just like a secret plot because those actually happen in real life. We know that. The study makes a clear distinction there, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. They differentiate between conspiracy, which they define as, I think the phrasing is, a secret plan by 2 or more powerful actors, something rooted in an actual event.
Okay.
And a conspiracy theory, which they describe as more of an accusatory interpretation that may or may not be true. It's that layer of suspicion, of interpretation, often without, solid evidence. That's what characterizes a conspiracy theory.
Got it. An accusatory interpretation. And what fuels these things? Why do they emerge and take hold? What are some of the underlying reasons?
The researchers highlight several factors. Sometimes they serve as a way to delegitimize opponents, politically perhaps, or to whitewash history, maybe reinterpret events in a more favorable light.
Or even hide actual wrongdoing.
Yes. And quite often, they seem to arise from just a fundamental human desire to understand things that feel chaotic or inexplicable or just deeply troubling. They offer some kind of explanation, even if it's a flawed one.
It's not just abstract thinking, though, is it? These beliefs can have really tangible effects in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. The study really underscores the potentially damaging consequences. Things like a decline in public trust in democratic institutions, an increase in political polarization.
Which we definitely see.
Right. Also, a weakening of faith in democratic processes themselves. And, in the worst case scenarios, these beliefs can even trigger violence.
It's a sobering thought, really. Now, while conspiracy theories might feel like a uniquely modern problem, maybe because of the internet or social media, the research reminds us they have a much, much longer history.
That's such an important perspective to keep in mind. Conspiracy theories are absolutely not new. The authors emphasize that they tend to thrive, to really flourish, during times of hardship and anxiety, wars, economic crises, pandemics. Sound familiar?
Yeah, unfortunately. They delve into some really compelling historical examples, too. Let's take ancient Rome, for instance. What happened there?
Yes. They mention how, after the Great Fire of Rome back in 64 AD, Emperor Nero himself actually came under suspicion. People thought maybe he started it.
Right.
So his response was classic deflection. He basically fabricated a conspiracy, accusing the early Christian community, and used that as a pretext for some pretty brutal persecution.
Wow. So blaming a minority group. And that's just the beginning, isn't it? We see these kinds of patterns echoing throughout history.
Indeed. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories offer a particularly tragic and recurring example. from medieval times blaming Jewish people for the plague,
Unbelievable.
to more recent conspiracies that fueled things like the Dreyfus Affair in France and ultimately the horrors of the Holocaust. This persistent, baseless belief in secret Jewish manipulation has had just devastating consequences.
The study also takes a close look at the United States, specifically, and how different periods in its history have given rise to their own unique sets of conspiracy theories. It's quite a historical sweep they do.
It really is. They start right back with the American Revolution, where some colonists genuinely believed there was this plot, orchestrated in London, to impose actual slavery upon them.
Okay.
Then, in the early days of the Republic, you had people like Jedediah Morse warning about the supposed influence of the Bavarian Illuminati, remember them, on Thomas Jefferson, of all people.
Illuminati, always popping up.
Right. And in the Civil War era, many slaveholders were convinced that abolitionists were secretly plotting to overthrow their entire way of life, to subvert the Republic.
And this thread just continues right through the 20th century and basically up to today, doesn't it?
Exactly. World War I brought government claims of German spies everywhere. World War II, the unfounded fear of sabotage by Japanese Americans, which led to their internment to terrible injustice fueled by conspiracy thinking. Then you have McCarthyism in the post-war period. The assassination of JFK, of course, spawned countless theories about CIA involvement or other plots.
Still debated today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
9/11 became incredibly fertile ground for theories about government prior knowledge or even involvement. And more recently, we've seen the rise of QAnon and the persistent big lie about the 2020 election. It really shows how these narratives, true or not, can get deeply woven into how a society understands major events.
So, shifting back to the present day, the study examined a specific selection of conspiracy theories across those 8 countries. How did the researchers decide which ones to focus on? There are so many out there.
That's a good question. They explained that they intentionally chose a mix. So some theories that have gained traction globally, things you hear about in multiple countries, and others that are more specific to particular national or regional contexts.
Yeah.
And the goal was to compare across this really diverse range of settings, connecting perspectives from, both Western and non-Western parts of the world.
Makes sense. Let's start with the COVID-19 related theories they investigated. There were a few prominent ones mentioned.
Yes. One theory they looked at, I think, in 6 countries was the idea that Big Pharma orchestrated SARS-CoV-2 and monkeypox for financial benefit, a classic follow-the-money type theory.
Right.
Another one, which they asked about in all 8 countries, was the claim that the pandemic is used by elites to swap capitalism with communism. This is often linked to that whole cultural Marxism idea. And then specifically in Brazil, Lebanon, Morocco, and South Africa, they explored the belief that Bill Gates and George Soros are responsible for the onset of the pandemic, targeting specific, high-profile individuals.
It is interesting how certain figures become focal points. The study also touches on other COVID-19 conspiracies that weren't maybe directly surveyed, but were still really widespread, right?
Exactly. They mentioned theories about the virus being, human-made, maybe in a Chinese lab, maybe by the pharma industry itself. There was the whole 5G thing, the idea that those waves were somehow involved.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
And even, disturbingly, anti-Semitic theories blaming Jewish people. Plus, of course, all the vaccine-related misinformation claims about microchips, links to autism or infertility, and those really extreme comparisons of public health measures to the Holocaust.
Just a whole spectrum of misinformation around that one event. And moving beyond the pandemic, the denial of climate change was another big area they focused on.
Yes, the belief that climate change is essentially a hoax and that scientists are deliberately lying to the public about it. They looked at this in all 8 countries. And this one obviously has huge implications for policy and how we address a really critical global issue.
Absolutely. Then the study drills down into examples of theories that are more unique to each specific country. And this really highlights how these beliefs get shaped by local history, local politics. Let's start with Australia. What did they find there?
Australia has some particularly intriguing ones. There's the enduring mystery around the disappearance of Prime Minister Harold Holt back in 1967. Theories range from a U.S. government cover-up to him being a Chinese spy who defected via submarine.
Wow, okay.
They also have their own variant of QAnon, which seems to have merged with anti-vax sentiments, anti-lockdown protests, that sort of thing. And there's also a more general belief found there, too, about secret powers, the CIA. Billionaire families secretly controlling the world.
And Brazil's recent political climate has also generated some very specific theories, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Brazilian version of the big lie is a major one. The claim that Bolsonaro actually won the 2022 election, despite all the evidence. This belief is still really strong among his supporters.
Fueling real unrest, too.
Exactly. Echoes of what happened in the U.S.
Canada, maybe surprisingly to some, seems to have its own set of quite specific locally targeted conspiracy theories as well.
Yes, they highlight things like the idea that the liberal media are essentially paid actors working for Justin Trudeau, and then the counter-accusation that conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is secretly a Russian agent.
So, targeting political figures directly.
Right. And there's also a very localized form of climate change denial, specifically focused on the claim that liberals and environmentalists are deliberately trying to destroy Alberta's oil sands industry.
Interesting how it gets tied to local economies. Now, Germany's complex history, that seems to play a significant role in the kinds of conspiracy theories prevalent there.
Definitely. I mean, beyond the global ones, Germany has its own versions of QAnon, and also the Reichscitizens or Reichsbürger movement. These groups deny the legitimacy of the modern German state, the Federal Republic.
Right.
Some even claim World War II never really ended, or that the Nazi regime somehow still exists. And really disturbingly, there are still theories blaming Jewish people for starting World War II, or even claiming Hitler survived 1945.
Just chilling echoes of the past. Moving to the Middle East, Lebanon has its own set of highly political conspiracy theories mentioned.
Yes, both the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri and the devastating Beirut port explosion in 2020 have become subjects of intense conspiratorial thinking.
Understandably, given the trauma.
For sure. Theories around Hariri's death often implicate Hezbollah and Syria. With the Beirut blast, you hear accusations of Israeli involvement, claims it was deliberate, perhaps targeting a supposed Hezbollah weapons cache rather than an accident. A lot of competing narratives.
And Morocco's history, particularly with colonialism, seems to influence its conspiracy landscape.
Yeah, the study suggests there's a historical undercurrent of suspicion towards foreign powers, dating back to colonial times. More recently, you see theories like the West funding ISIL to destabilize the region, or even quite bizarre ones like blaming Jewish people for Princess Diana's death.
Wow.
And COVID conspiracies there also seem to tap into existing government distrust and maybe suspicion about Western motives towards Arab nations.
Now, South Africa's history, especially apartheid and the HIV/AIDS crisis, has tragically fueled some very specific and harmful conspiracy theories.
Yes, the Mbeki era of AIDS denialism is a stark example questioning the virus itself, its dangers, the effectiveness of treatments.
Which had devastating public health consequences.
Absolutely devastating. And there are also these deeply damaging racially charged theories that AIDS was created by white people to kill black people, or that a cure exists but is being hidden by white scientists or businesses. It's a really troubling legacy of mistrust and misinformation.
Just awful. Finally, turning back to the United States, which, as we've discussed, has a long and varied history of these theories. What recent ones did the study highlight?
Well, they point to the enduring truther conspiracy about 9/11, the idea of U.S. government involvement. The persistent birther conspiracy questioning Barack Obama's birthplace.
Still pops up sometimes.
It does. And of course, the incredibly influential big lie regarding the 2020 election outcome, which continues to shape political discourse there.
It really is a global phenomenon, but with such distinct local flavors. Now, the study goes beyond just listing these theories. It actually tries to measure how widespread these beliefs are. What did they find about prevalence? Are these fringe ideas?
Well, that's one of the most striking findings, actually. Conspiracy theories are not fringe. The study concludes they are quite mainstream. How mainstream? Well, in every single one of the 8 countries they studied, at least one conspiracy theory was supported by over 25% of the people surveyed.
Wow, over a quarter of the population for at least one theory in every country. That's significant.
It really is. It underscores just how pervasive these beliefs have become.
Were there any particular types of theories that seemed more popular overall at the time they did the survey?
They did observe that with the exception of Brazil, the COVID-19 related theories tended to be more widely accepted than climate change denial. This was in early 2023 when the survey was done.
Okay.
Which probably reflects, the immediate sense of crisis and uncertainty the pandemic had created just prior to that. Climate change, while critical, might feel less immediately threatening day to day for some.
That makes sense. And what about the people who weren't necessarily firm believers, but also didn't outright reject these theories? The study mentioned a notable uncertain category. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. Across the different theories and across all the countries, a pretty substantial chunk of people typically between 15 and 30%, sometimes even higher in Lebanon and Morocco, put themselves in this uncertain box. So, not sure. Well, that's the question, isn't it? Does this reflect genuine uncertainty, like people haven't made up their minds? Or could it be perhaps a sort of convenient middle ground, maybe for people who have some suspicions but are hesitant to fully endorse a theory that might seem, a bit out there?
Right, a socially acceptable way to express doubt without fully committing.
Possibly. It's definitely an area that needs more research to understand what's really going on with that uncertain group.
Absolutely. Okay, now, the crucial question. Who believes? Who are the individuals who tend to be more drawn to these conspiracy theories? The study looked at a whole range of personal factors, right?
Yes, they examined sociopolitical factors, psychological ones, and basic demographics to see if consistent patterns emerged among believers.
And what were some of the more consistent factors they identified, at least in the Western democracies and Brazil?
Okay, so across many of those contexts, a few things consistently showed up. Younger age tended to correlate with belief, also a right-leaning political ideology, and especially populist attitudes that showed a strong positive link.
Populism, interesting.
Yeah. Also, dissatisfaction with how democracy is working in their country, and a higher degree of religiosity. Those also tended to be associated with greater belief.
Yeah, and what about psychologically?
One really interesting finding was self-esteem. Lower self-esteem consistently showed a strong negative correlation. So people with lower self-esteem were more likely to believe.
Okay, so it's not necessarily just about, say, lack of education or information, as some might assume. How did education fit in it? That was less consistent, wasn't it?
Exactly. That's a really important nuance. While there was a general tendency for higher education levels to correlate with lower belief in conspiracy theories, it wasn't always statistically significant. It varied across theories and countries. Same with economic status generally. Higher status meant less belief, but again, not a super strong or consistent finding everywhere. Political interest was also complex. You could find high interest at both ends of the spectrum, including among conspiracy believers.
Any other psychological factors?
In Lebanon specifically, they found that a higher need for cognitive closure, basically, a desire for firm answers, and an intolerance for ambiguity seemed relevant. People who wanted things black and white were more likely to believe.
That makes intuitive sense. Now, it sounds like the picture changes somewhat when you look at the non-Western countries in the study. That profile might not fit everywhere.
That's a really key takeaway, yes. In Lebanon, Morocco, and South Africa, many of the factors that were significant predictors in the West and Brazil, like political ideology or dissatisfaction with democracy, seemed to lose their influence. They weren't as strongly linked to belief.
So what was relevant there?
Well, it varied, but for example, in South Africa, the factors that seemed more relevant were things like age, gender, sometimes education, urban versus rural residence, maybe economic status, and again, self-esteem. It suggests the underlying drivers might be different, perhaps reflecting different social issues, historical contexts, or political dynamics.
That's really fascinating. So the typical believer profile isn't universal?
Not necessarily, no. Context really matters.
And did the study find that if you believe in one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe in others? Is there a kind of general conspiracy mindset?
Yes, that's another very important point they make. The study found that within any given country, the characteristics of someone who believes in one type of conspiracy theory, say a global one like Big Pharma, are generally quite similar to the characteristics of someone who believes in a totally different type, maybe a very local one or one that leans left versus right politically. So, this strongly suggests that it's less about alignment with one specific theory's content and more about a general tendency, a predisposition perhaps, towards conspiratorial thinking overall.
A general conspiratorial mindset.
Right.
So let's try to bring this all together for you, our listener. What are the main points we should really take away from this deep dive into conspiracy theories and the people who believe them?
Okay, well, firstly, it's crystal clear that conspiracy theories aren't some niche thing. They are widespread, a global phenomenon, and they have a long, complex history. They're not new.
Right. Mainstream, not fringe.
Exactly. And while the specific content varies hugely depending on the local culture and politics, the study does suggest some common characteristics among believers, particularly in Western democracies and Brazil. Things like populist attitudes, maybe lower self-esteem.
But that profile isn't universal.
Precisely. It doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. No. The factors driving belief can look different in different parts of the world.
And that significant uncertain group, the 15 to 30%, seems really crucial to keep in mind too. We don't fully know what drives their uncertainty.
Absolutely. The fact that so many people aren't definitively rejecting these theories, even if they're not fully endorsing them, highlights a real need for deeper understanding. Why are they uncertain? What information are they weighing?
And ultimately, this research really underscores the potential risks when widespread belief in misinformation takes hold in our societies.
Indeed. It raises serious questions about the health of our democratic institutions, about public trust, and about public health itself, especially when large numbers of people seem to find it difficult to sort credible information from, well, unfounded claims.
This has been a truly illuminating exploration, digging into this complex topic. It certainly gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. So here's maybe a final thought for you to ponder. Considering that consistent finding, particularly in the West, of a link between populist attitudes and this conspiratorial thinking, what does that tell us about our current political landscape? And what are the real challenges we face in trying to foster a more informed, more reasoned public discourse in an environment where these ways of thinking seem so prevalent? Definitely something worth mulling over.
And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for more captivating deep dives like this one. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.